Hi everyone, I'm Rose Webb, who's recently been appointed to the position of Chair of the National Committee of the NGOs National Regulators Community of Practice. I'm really sorry I can't be here live for this webinar today. I'm retiring in a couple of days' time on 10 December from my full-time role in the Better Regulation Division in the New South Wales Government. And so in the meantime, I do have a few meetings and unfortunately I clash today. But very soon I'll be free to devote some more time to the wonderful work of the National Regulators Community of Practice. I'm really looking forward to getting into this job and getting organised for next year. We're already starting our planning. We're going to continue our great webinar series that has brought so many people together during the last couple of years and brought so many great speakers and topics to everyone's attention. We're also looking to see, hopefully, that we can get some networking happening with each of the chapters of the National Regulators Community of Practice, have an opportunity maybe for some hybrid events where people in a particular city can get together and meet their fellow regulators, but we also get the benefit of the series, the webinar or the forum that they have and be able to share that with people around Australia. So we're just getting ready on that program, but already some great topics are being lined up. We're also working on maybe having a national conference. Again, just fingers crossed that COVID will permit us to do that. And I think that will be great as to finally, have the opportunity to really get together. As well, we're encouraging each of the chapters to continue the good work of getting more members and keeping people together, getting opportunities to share information about regulatory practice in the particular regions. The final big piece of work that we're doing, of course, is our professional development work, and the Australian professional development work is going to be our Foundations of Regulatory Practice program. Work is well underway with this and really appreciate all the contributions we've already had from so many of you and looking forward to continuing those contributions as we develop our program. I think most of you know that our program is very much based on the program that New Zealand has been running from the New Zealand Government Regulators Forums and their great work that the G-Reg program has done. And so we're really delighted that today we have our New Zealand colleagues here to tell us all about how the government regulatory arrangements work in New Zealand and how they've benefited from being able to get together and have a great professional development program over there. So really looking forward to catching up with this webinar when I get a chance. I hope you all enjoy it. And I'll now hand over to Sally, who's going to be your facilitator for today.
Kia ora tātou, ko Sally Washington toku ingoa. Tēnā koutou katoa. So good afternoon and welcome to this NZOG NRCoP webinar on professional development for regulators. What can the Aussies learn from the Kiwi experience? And I think my New Zealand colleagues here would just think this is more about what we can learn from each other than just you learning from your Kiwis. So we have people from all over the world in this webinar. So I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, wherever you are in the world, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. In my case, this is the tangata whenua of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm Sally Washington. I'm the NZOG Director for Aotearoa, which is a new role, and I'm delighted to be curating this conversation today. I feel I've got connections to both sides of the Tasman actually, and to both the communities of practice that are joining us today. So it's great to finish off this 2021 program of webinars by joining these two communities up. So before I introduce our speakers, some housekeeping. So as you know, people have been in these before, all the webinars are recorded and they'll be made available on NZOG's YouTube channel within about 14 days. So I hope you can stick with us for the full 90 minutes today. It's a bit longer than usual, but if you have to leave early, you can always watch later. And you can jump on any line at any time and watch all of the 17 webinars from last year and the 12 completed for this year. So that's quite a lot. And I'm sure that's going to compete with your Christmas viewing of Love Actually. But anyway, that's an alternative this year. So as you can see, we'll be using the Slido app for your questions and comments. So that should be on the screen now. And then you can hashtag Reg New Zealand as Reg NZ as your event code for questions. And you can start asking questions anytime. One of them might be, how did you have such a bad start? Or if you like the look of another question that someone's put up, you can upvote it. So we'll attempt to get to as many of your questions as we can during the Q&A session, but our presenters have said that they will respond to some of those later if we don't get to them in this session. And that resource will be added to the webinar recording and available on the NRCoP website as well. So now it's my privilege to introduce this great bunch of speakers we have today. With such an accomplished group, I'll keep these short and sweet, otherwise I think we're going to be here all day. So let's go to our first speaker is the camera on? Keith. Keith Manch is the Chief Executive and Director of the Civil Aviation Authority. Keith has been involved in developing regulatory people and organisational capability across central and local government in New Zealand since 2008. I like to think of him as sort of like the godfather of regulation in New Zealand, in the sense of, you know, a mentor and a guide, not the horse's head in a bed kind of godfather. Tēnā koe, Keith. Then we have Wendy Kale, who's also been involved in professionalising New Zealand's regulatory system since 2007, when the idea was first proposed to create a common qualification for central and local government regulatory organisations. Wendy currently works at Waka Kotahi, the New Zealand Transport Agency, where she created the award-winning Regulators Room, which is a resource hub and collaborative space for regulators. Kia ora, Wendy.
Kia ora.
Then we have Dr Rebecca Foley, and Rebecca's involved with Regulatory Stewardship branch at the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment in Wellington. And some of you will have already heard from Rebecca at an NRCoP webinar on regulatory stewardship that was held in May. No mai hoki mai, Rebecca. And then we have Ian Kaplan, who's a principal advisor at G-Reg and well known to the regulatory practitioners on both sides of the Tasman. Ian's on the NRCoP National Committee. Ian's kind of like the film star of regulation, and some of you will have seen his regulatory comms webinar back in February, and also some of his recent films. Kia ora e hoa. And then to Tony McKenna is the Technical Program Manager for Skills New Zealand. Tony has over 20 years experience in workplace education. He's currently working with NRCoP to develop the Foundations of Regulatory Professionalism program. Tēnā koe, Tony. And last but not least, our lovely Dr Lorraine Cherney from my NZOG colleague, who's well known to many of you. She's the manager of the NRCoP at NZOG and leading the program of professional development for Australian regulators. This is Lorraine's third webinar for the year. Welcome, Lorraine, and I think you're going to need a really good break after this. So this panel event with NRCoP and NZOG and G-Reg is timely as NRCoP work towards developing a 6-module online professional development program for regulators. The Australian program, as I said, is called the Foundations of Regulatory Practice. It's designed to support Australian regulators to upskill, to help them speak a common language, and to create regulators that have transferable skills, so people who can move around the system. And it's a great idea to reflect on the New Zealand experience of developing and implementing a similar approach to investing in the regulatory profession. So today we're going to find out what can Australia learn from the Kiwi experience and vice versa. And if the Kiwis had the opportunity to do this again, what would they do differently? And we're hoping that they're going to share with us some tips, tricks and pitfalls involved in rolling out a program like this. And then we need to think in the current context of how does this thing work online? So today's panel will cover these topics and many more, I'm sure. And we'll finish with Lorraine giving us an overview and an update on the Australian Foundations for Regulatory Practice. But first we're going to go for a game. It's a game or a test for you if you like. And so have a look at this image which comes from the G-Reg program. I want you to look at this image and see if you can identify how many regulations you think there might be in the image. So write down your guess on a piece of paper, and later on Tony's going to return to this image and provide an answer. So let's see how accurate you all are. No pressure there. So now I'll hand over to Keith and Wendy, who will talk to us about the origins of the G-Reg program and the journey from that very beginning until now. Over to you, Keith.
Kia ora. Thank you, Sally, and thank you for the kind introduction.
So the slide you have before you is titled Professional Development for Regulators. That is the focus of it, but I guess if we step back and think about it, it's actually about professionalising regulatory practice, and you'll pick that up from the discussion today. Next slide, please. New Zealand's journey to what is now G-Reg started in May 2008 with the Compliance Common Capability Programme, or the CCCP. The briefing that supported the initial meeting of multiple agencies who established the CCCP, and those agencies remain engaged in G-Reg today, identified, quote, good reasons for taking a whole of government approach to developing national qualifications in regulation and compliance. In government speak of the time, those good reasons were built around being an employer of choice, delivering value for money, ensuring coordinated state services, and also supporting trusted state services. Early on in the discussions around this approach, we acknowledged that the regulatory systems are not the sole preserve of central government, so local government has been a major participant since day one, and that's been very important to the program overall. We also recognised the similarities between what regulators did, not focusing on the differences was important. We got buy-in to the idea that there were 80% similar functions that we all undertook in terms of 20% different subject matter of regulatory focus, not the other way around. So we were 80-20 similar as opposed to 20-80 similar. That helped to crack the code that enabled regulators engaged in economic, social, safety, financial, environmental, regulatory activities to see value in being part of something bigger than them. And that holds true today. The last key design element, I guess, was we thought it was all well and good to enhance people capability, but if people are working in organisations that don't have capability at an organisational level, then the system won't improve. So you'll see as we go through this presentation, our efforts went beyond people capability and also focused on organisational capability. Could I have the next slide, please? So to elaborate on the good reasons for taking a whole of government approach, we framed up what we saw as benefits of having a professional compliance community. And what we looked at were 4 dimensions. One is the benefits for regulated communities or regulated parties. One benefit would be that they could know and understand good practice and then respond effectively. We could also reduce uncertainty of how regulators operate, remembering that regulated parties typically engage with many of us at the same time, and that would build trust and confidence. From a people perspective, we thought the benefits were having transferable skills, better career prospects, feeling valued, supported and engaged, and having a better understanding of roles and functions. For our organisations, we would have a pool of well-trained, competent people, potentially lower recruitment risks, and also cost-effective investment in L&D activities. From a government overall perspective, we were looking at information, knowledge, innovation, training, operating on the basis of do it once and use it many times, which underpins trust from competence across the system. So they were the benefits that we saw, and I think we see today. Next slide, please. As I noted, we soon realised in the discussions that a combination of work on people and organisational capability activities would be needed. The combination of these things would amount to the development of a professional community of regulatory professionals. This essentially formed the 3-legged stool that G-Reg continues to sit on today. I'm going to hand over to Wendy now to drop down and talk about some of the operational elements of CCCP as it moved into G-Reg.
Thanks for that, Keith. And just building on what Keith said, there were sort of 4 key themes from the earliest years. I had a very operational part in this, but even from an operational point of view, these were some of the things that emerged. Confirming our common ground, taking a collective approach, maintaining our effort and being resilient, and leadership. Next slide, thanks. So from the point of view of confirming our common ground, regulators have a lot in common, and we intuitively knew this, but it was important to prove this to ourselves and to make that visible. So we carried out some basic research, and that was a very powerful thing to do because it gave us something to gather around, to some focus, and it shaped our further action. And the research showed two main things. Firstly, regulators really do carry out similar kinds of activities, as you can see from the graph. And secondly, that they often work with each other as part of carrying out that regulatory work. And because they naturally have common ground, they can learn a great deal from each other. And this was the justification for common qualifications. Next slide, thank you. Now, the research led on to some early work, such as creating a simple glossary of definitions and activities, which you can see here. This is not flash, but it did the job and it got us talking. And then we just developed things further as we went on. Next slide. We developed a shared professional development program through qualifications, and this enabled some simple career mapping. Now, these things help the sector to see itself as a community with common practices, common language, and common aspirations. Next slide, thank you. One of the second things that emerged from this for me was about working collectively for the common good. Now, this principle did emerge instantly and has continued to this day, and it means that everyone involved with this work has to think beyond the individual perspective to the collective. We needed to generously support each other to achieve our common goals. And that collectivism and volunteerism generated some really great work in the early days. The steering group was very active. Members promoted the work, invited colleagues and other agencies to participate. As Keith said, local government came to the table very early on, and then we just kept inviting people in to whatever appropriate forum we had for them to participate in. We created cross-sector industry advisory groups to inform the content of the qualifications. And after that, we formed a group to carry out the work program made up of regulatory practitioners and learning practitioners. This operational arm of the project got called different things at different times. At one stage, it was the Regulatory Capability Learning Council, and at another point, it was the 3D network, with the 3D standing for Design, Development and Delivery. The process of doing this work in common brought regulatory practitioners together to define practice, define language, create materials, share experiences, and learn from each other. And this formed close connections and a sense of belonging. And in terms of supporting volunteers, it was really important to recognise that we were working with volunteers, that even if people were committed and enthusiastic, that even if they had the organisation's permission to be involved, they had competing demands on their time because of their substantive jobs, which sometimes called them away from their participation at short notice. So we made it absolutely fine for people to do what they could when they could. We reinforced that they were part of a collective effort and didn't have to carry anything on their own. We were careful to make really good use of people's time, be well organised, communicate well. We provided lots of support, encouragement, recognition and thanks. And we ensured that people benefited from participating through learning, networking and relationship building, and that they could see how their work was contributing to the greater good. And we celebrated milestones and successes. Next slide, thank you. So, what did all this collective effort tangibly create? Qualifications and standards, assessment guides, some learning materials, a good regulatory practice guide for organisations called Achieving Compliance, a shared resource and communications hub, which you can see here, a skills framework in the making, an effective regulator practice workshop, and information and discussion forums. Next slide, thanks. The third theme of this was about maintaining our effort and being resilient. And it's been really important to put the effort in over the long haul. And this has definitely been a marathon effort, not a short sprint. It's required lots and lots of promotion and relationship building, linking in with special interest groups, any existing conferences and events, developing relationships with people in the sector, continually educating, re-educating and recruiting. And we also had to deal with waves of change washing over the program. And the big one for me was in 2011, our first requalifications had just appeared on the National Qualifications Framework. And then within months, a reform of the qualification system was announced, which meant that those new qualifications wouldn't exist for very long. And around the same time, we had a change of industry training organisation ownership and had to navigate that, which was about a relationship with a really important major stakeholder that was responsible for creating those qualifications. But the good news is that we made the most of the challenges. We worked with the new ITO to create a new set of qualifications, and this actually strengthened both the qualifications and our relationship with the new ITO. And then last but not least, we've got leadership. And from an operational point of view, it was really important to lead by example. We were just a small band of committed people basically getting on and doing what we saw was useful. And that actually had quite a bit of power. The early work we did, the prototypes, helped people see what could be achieved, gave them the confidence to also get involved. And one little example of this, when the current qualifications were created, a small group of agencies that was willing to pilot them, called the early adopters, worked together to support each other in doing this. Each agency had its own approach, but we met regularly, compared notes, shared the materials we'd created to wrap around the qualification program and the lessons that we were learning. And the result was that we showed how the qualification could be implemented in a concrete way, which made it easy for other agencies to follow suit and do the same. So back to Keith with, I guess, the next slide. Thanks.
Thanks, Wendy. So all of the work that Wendy referred to was carried out essentially on a voluntary basis, and that was between the period 2008 and 2012. In 2012, we created a secretariat and managed to extract small amounts of money from agencies to help support paying for that. The secretariat, it turned out, was hosted at Maritime New Zealand, where I was the CE at the time, and the person who was the secretariat was actually Wendy. We also recognised the need to create a more lasting structure and approach. We had what feels like countless discussions about how we would do that. And then the inquiry into regulatory institutions and practices by the Productivity Commission took place in 2014. And that provided a really good vehicle for engaging and asserting, I guess, that the CCCP would be a useful program for the Productivity Commission to think about and focus on, with the potential for recommending the establishment of a more permanent program. Something that kind of institutionalised the efforts that we'd done and the work that had been put in by so many people over so much time. Ultimately, the Productivity Commission recommended what is now G-Reg, and that includes the three legs of the stool that I referred to before: people capability, qualifications being the most prominent offering, if you like, CPD, conferences, and now about to kick off in coming months, a master's level opportunity in public administration with a strong regulatory theme. On the organisational capability leg, we've now got governance level training going on with board chairs and board members. We've got a peer learning initiative where a team of senior regulators will work within an agency on their request to focus on a problem or an opportunity around regulatory practice. We've worked with people like the Real Estate Authority, Wellington City Council, WorkSafe, Conservation, and currently there's some work going on with the Ministry for Environment. We have a process we refer to as reflection. So whenever there's an independent report into an element of regulatory practice, we review that and try and draw system lessons and use that to improve and share across the system. That's led to some work that's going on at the moment to beef up potentially investigations training initiatives for all of the public sector and local government. The sum of all of this, in my mind, represents the components of a profession, hence a professional community of regulatory professionals. So what's next for G-Reg? Well, I think our focus at the moment is strengthening G-Reg and also strengthening its contribution to New Zealand's regulatory stewardship agenda. People and organisational capability are a key foundation to regulatory stewardship, as is strengthening the engagement of practice in policy. High-level reflections, you do need to take a long-term view. I think whenever we're looking at this, it needs to be thought of in the next 10 years. Champions are critical. We've had a relatively small number of really committed people that have stayed the term since 2008, and many of them are still present in the environment here. Resilience is required, and Wendy made that point. You can expect peaks and troughs. The good thing with G-Reg is the troughs now bottom out at a higher level than they did in the early days. Even when we aren't making the progress that we really desire, good stuff is happening. So that's the story at a nutshell around CCCP through to G-Reg. And that's the end of our part of the session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Keith and Wendy, and that story just really resonates with me, as I learned a lot from your story when I was setting up the policy project in New Zealand, which was a similar sort of thing to improve the quality of policy advice and policy capability across government. And you know, the way you said it in such a straightforward way belies the, you know, how important and difficult that process is, but it really resonated with me, and I think it's so important to think about the system and the whole infrastructure in a change program like this, which is as you say, Keith, you know, a long-term thing that needs to be worked on. So that's a great start, looking at the system level. So now we're going to hand over to Rebecca and Ian, who will dig a little bit deeper and see about how you implement a program of learning in the New Zealand public sector in this case. And then and Rebecca will talk about how that's operated in her organisation. And I can say, so I think Ian's going to start, aren't you, Ian? Ian can be a very persuasive man, so having him with G-Reg has been great. And he's even managed to force me into a cameo role in one of his films, which was quite a hard ask, I think. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Sally, and kia ora, everyone. Rebecca and I will deal with the kind of the embedding of G-Reg, as Sally has said. First of all, Sally, just to acknowledge your role, more than a mere cameo, going to a fundamental question in one of the 5 G-Reg films which are out now, and I'm not on 13% commission, on relationships and conversations between regulatory and policy practitioners, which are essential to making regulatory practice and the landscape effectively really work. I'm still sort of stranded in the G-Reg studio. I have actually left, for those of you who have since been watching the webinars. I maybe look like I'm positioned in the same place with a colleague. I'm, having said that, still in the gravitational theme of the webinars, and I'm going to then stick to the 7 friendly tips in 5 minutes about how we've looked to kind of navigate the New Zealand landscape. And the first one, if I was making a program, I have a little ding on the screen and a voiceover and something saying location, location, location. How do we position it in New Zealand? There are different agencies, different people, but for a twist of history, Australia, New Zealand and the United Kingdom could have very differently constituted civil and public services, possibly an institute, or rather a ministry for regulators, possibly a more homogenised civil service. History didn't roll the dice that way since the Northcote Trevelyan reforms of 1854 or so. And so we do have scattered across the public service people and agencies who are in very different institutional positions as to how they appreciate what their regulatory capability is, their membership of being part of one regulatory sector with the stewardship and the system related obligations that go with it. So how do we locate and then bring people in? And how do I try to be persuasive with my colleagues, as Sally kindly suggests? This is where option 2 comes in of 7, money, money, money. I don't really mean money, I mean commonality and common currency. The motif piece of G-Reg probably is the G-Reg regulatory compliance qualification, in particular level 3, which in many ways is, before all of us, I suspect, were born, something that was taught in high school. Civics, how does government work? And if you look at certain civics textbooks that you can still get in charity shops where I sometimes hang around, apart from a couple of unpolitically correct references, not much has basically changed in terms of the machinery of government that people need to know. How much more we say it should be a part of common currency as ensconced in level 3, that anyone in the public service has that. And that really, I think, riffs into what the model that ANZSOG are looking to promote, and that G-Reg and ANZSOG can institutionally learn very much from each other. The idea of a tradable currency, the idea of levels that actually have different on-ramps. Lawyers and accountants have their own professional club. This is a professional club, not in an elitist sense, but it is a demarked profession. I then go on to item 3 of 7, close encounters of the regulatory kind, which isn't as spooky as it sounds. It's really another way of saying relationships and commonality and community. We're not alone. The very reason that G-Reg and ANZSOG, and actually also coming online soon, if not immediately, the United Kingdom Institute of Regulatory Professionals, can talk to each other, as we have so much in common. Grant Pink, Professor Grant Pink, who many viewers will know, has recently published a book which we featured in our episode 5 of the webinars, which again, I'm not on commission, are going online on Friday, called Navigating Regulatory Language. I think Keith has either put a forward or a commentary in. The idea that we do have a common language, we have to be careful what we say in terms of what we mean and whether we mean it mutually, but we all have an awful lot in common. The other point, number 4, is Broadchurch. Again, not the detective show, but to say that it's not just about the qualifications. G-Reg also has a wealth of uncredentialized learning that A, comes from the network I've described, B, has those sorts of products that don't lead to qualifications, like conferences, but are no less important. Things, for example, like webinars like this. Other things also, for example, the peer learning network, which Keith touched upon, the idea of being able to quietly beta test something with your professional peers in a way that is just helpful to enrich the professional goals that we all have of having a better regulatory system. And that's really the kind of married at first sight peer-to-peer point, which is my number 6. But because I've only got 1 minute left, I'm going to elide my 6 and 7 together. And that's modernity and Graham Norton, because both of those very much are themes for 2020 and 2021 webinar conferences, both of which are online. The idea that a modern regulator is a well put together regulator, and it's also about the well-being of that regulator, as well as those regulator regulates. And the Graham Norton point is, of course, conversations. Relationships, we say, are everything, and it's about dealing better together. Now, how do you embed that in the ministry near you? And Rebecca is going to talk about that.
Thank you, Ian. I'm going to talk about how we embedded the core knowledge qualification in the G-Reg suite of qualifications here at the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. First of all, I'm going to proudly claim that I have got my G-Reg core knowledge level 3 qualification. Got that a couple of years ago. And actually earlier this year, Ian proudly handed me my level 4 qualification. Doing the level 4 really brought home to me the skill of frontline compliance work. And I actually have to say I really enjoyed doing it. I will have complete disclosure and tell you that I did not actually pass 2 of the modules. I failed them, I failed the exam, but then I got to engage with an assessor and I could free text my answers, which really suited me. And so I'm really proud to claim level 4 as well. So MB, or Ministry of Innovation, Employment, and just another one, was an early adopter of the G-Reg qualifications. And so I want to focus on some work we did around 2018, 2019 to really push forward with getting more people engaged and completed with the core knowledge qualification. So I'm going to tell you what our situation was, what we did and what the results were. And then I've got 4 tips, not 7. So the situation was, in November 2018, we had 530 people out of our workforce of approximately 4,000 enrolled in level 3. And of those 530, we had 57% having passed the qualification. But obviously the question is always like, well, how many should we have? So a bit of light touch analysis indicated that we should have approximately 2,000 roles where the qualification would help build regulatory capability. And that's much broader than just our delivery or operational arms. Like we're talking about policy people, research people, evaluation people. The thought being that if they could all understand the regulatory world, it would help all of us. And at that stage, the uptake of the qualification was largely due to it being championed by leaders here in MB, and you were just able to apply and do it through the online learning platform, so sort of like a self-study option. At the same time, in my regulatory stewardship team, we recognised a gap in MB of knowledge about why regulatory systems and stewardship of those systems was really important, and then what it actually meant for people in their roles. So we saw an opportunity to introduce those concepts to sit alongside the G-Reg qualification. So we created a partnership between my team, the regulatory stewardship team, with one of our biggest delivery groups called Market Services, and also with our internal learning and development people, to find a way to drive increased participation and completion of the core knowledge qualification, with the ultimate goal of increasing regulatory capability and understanding of regulatory systems and stewardship here at MB. So what did we do to get to those outcomes? Well, first of all, we actually took a learner-centred approach, and we surveyed our 530 people who had either completed or were still in progress with their core knowledge qualification. And the signals that came back to us was that we need time and support to complete the qualification. And we actually also need to know how it relates to our jobs. So how do we embed it into our practice here at MB? So we took those insights and we designed an approach to create a supported learning environment for our core knowledge learners. So what does that mean? What it means is this is pre-COVID, we brought together people physically in small groups to complete each of the 6 modules of core knowledge with a trained facilitator. We also created additional material for each of the 6 modules that linked the topic back to MB's work. So we'd have examples or quizzes or internal experts talking about the topics in an MB context. And we also produced some additional material to explain what regulatory systems are and why stewardship of them is important. So as an example, module 4 in the core knowledge focuses on compliance activities. So for the cohorts, we brought in an experienced regulator who spoke about a multi-agency operation and how that operation used different compliance tools to achieve its outcomes. Furthermore, we actually recognised you couldn't just have one approach for our learners. So over time, we developed 4 approaches. So the self-study option, which is sort of the default option. Then we had our cohort model where people were brought together in the small groups. So they actually had 7 facilitated workshops. So an introductory one to introduce the qual, why it was important, what regulatory systems are, what regulatory stewardship is, and then a workshop for each of the 6 remaining modules, at the end of which learners would actually complete the module assessment together. So a third way we opened up was actually to have a boot camp. So for 1 hour, we had a personal trainer facilitator who would book a room and people could come along and just get assistance for whichever of the 6 modules they were a wee bit stuck on and needed help on. And finally, we developed a semester approach for our contact centre staff who cannot easily come off the phones to do professional training. So they had 4 sessions held over a year with 2 modules per session. So we intended to start slowly and build up, which was not the actual experience. We found that within 6 months, our enrolments had doubled to over 1,000 people, and we shifted from a 57% completion rate to an 85% completion rate. So we surveyed our learners again, and we found that they were really, the additional course content that we had generated was really resonating with them, and they were able to see how the qualification applied to them and their work. The cohort approach gave them the motivation to continue either on their own or as part of the cohort. And it was really important to them that being able to discuss the concepts and put it into the MB context really helped them understand. So some of the tips and tricks, I'll give you 4. One is, I think, work out what your learners really need. So obviously we were told time, support, and practical examples. Second, kind of like spillover benefits, we found that putting the time into the support not only helped completion rates, but we also had spillover benefits such as developing additional skills, so the trained facilitators that we developed, and also recreated new networks between our staff, which goes back to your conversation point. Third, leadership commitment really matters. So seeing leaders complete and support the qualifications and giving their staff the time to do it really helped. I had one of our Deputy Chief Executives make a special drive-by to my pod to tell me he had completed the qualification, which I think is a great signal of leadership there. And finally, we discovered that data can drive good competition. So we made it visible as to the enrolment and completion rates of each of our groups here. And I could tell you that nobody wanted to be the group with the lowest enrolment or completion rates. So that's our example. Back to you. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And in particular, how all of those, that it's not just about people who are involved in compliance regulation, but the wider, the people that they interface with, that they have to be savvy about regulation as well. So you talked about policy and evaluation and research and people like that in MB. And I have to say, anything that resembles a boot camp doesn't sound very good to me, but obviously it's very successful. So thank you so much for that. So now we're going to move on to Tony, who's going to talk about the G-Reg program too, and some of the answers to the question to the streetscape image that we put up at the front to see how clever we all are, or what great regulators we are. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Sally. Kia ora, everyone. I've been in the very fortunate position of working at Skills Organisation and having come in pretty much when the G-Reg initiative was already being well established. And why that was fortunate was that I already had a very motivated sector that really wanted to do something different, if you like, and challenge what was the normal way of delivering vocational education in New Zealand. So we sat down with the group that Wendy mentioned, the 3D network, so the design, deliver, goodness me, I keep getting it all wrong, anyway, the 3D network. And what we did was we tried to work out, well, what would be the best way to offer the qualifications to a very wide range of organisations and across the country, because essentially regulators aren't all based in one place. They're all over the place, from local bodies right through to both central and central government agencies, but of course all of their branches and allied pieces of work that they do right around the country. So the model we came up with in the end was that the best way we could do this was to deliver it as an online package. And so the challenge there was that if you develop something where you want to award a qualification at the end of it, you have to have some mechanism to assess it. And one of the challenges there was, how many assessors would you need to assess hundreds, if not thousands, of people? And it worked out that it made sense that we come up with a more of an online automated approach to this. So we've actually created a methodology, if you like, that starts with the individual learners enrolling into a learning management platform, accessing the modules of learning content, and as they complete those modules, they have an assessment released to them. Now, the assessments were set up so that the individual gets questions pulled from what were called question sets, and they got 3 goes at every question. Obviously not the same question each time, but it was drawn from 3 different question sets. So it was randomized. They could potentially get the same question, but quite often they got a different one. And the idea there was that the individual would get 2 goes by themselves, and through some of the mechanisms that Rebecca's talked about, could also share those assessment questions and discuss them collectively, commit the answer that they needed to that question. But if they didn't succeed, they got a second go. After the second go, though, if they still struggled, then we kicked into a system where a person had been designated as their learner support. So it could be one of the champions that Rebecca talked about at MB, for example, or I know at NZTA Wakakotahi as well, but it also could just be their manager. And the idea was that they could intervene before they made the 3rd attempt at the assessment, and they could actually discuss the question, go back to the learning content, refer to that material and see if they could come to the correct answer. And the intention there was that in most cases, learners would make it through successfully after no more than 3 attempts. Obviously, the online world is different. It's much more challenging. You can't get angry at a computer. you can kick it or thump it, I suppose, but you can't actually interact with a human, which makes it quite challenging. There are a lot of people, we found initially that we had to work through just the way an online system works. So we had to put a lot of support material into, you know, how to log in, how to access their dashboards, how to access the learning material, how to work through the assessments. But over time, of course, people have become more and more familiar with that. I think if you all think about less than 2 years ago, how familiar you were with Zoom or Microsoft Teams and how much more straightforward that that platform is now. The same is applied across the online world. The participants today are very familiar with working in an online environment and understand logging in and so on, the mechanics of this. So the basic program was, we decided we'd offer the core knowledge, so the level 3, as a 6-module online package of learning and assessment. We chose 6 modules really because of the way the content fell out of the qualifications. So there wasn't, it was great because we had qualifications to underpin this, but actually in the work we've been starting to do with ANZOG, it still naturally falls out that there's about 6 topics that a regulator who's coming in new to the system needs to know about. But what I think also was really critical, and one of the things that was great about working with G-Reg right from the beginning, was that the sector themselves were adamant that pretty much they wanted everyone to complete core knowledge, regardless of whether they had a year's experience in regulation or 30 years in experience. And the reason for that was partly to go back to what Ian talked about. We were talking about trying to have a common language for regulators and about trying to have a common understanding and a resetting of that understanding, which the core knowledge basically gave. So I know that we had people in there who completed this qualification who had PhDs in regulation and still found that they learned something of use from the package. So that's always encouraging. It's not so nice to hear that somebody fails, Rebecca, but I know that we had good support mechanisms in there to make sure that there really isn't a point of failure for completing the quals, and that we're there to try and support people to achieve them. So basically we've had the level 3 core knowledge operating since 2016. We've had the level 4 operational knowledge working since 2018, and then we have been offering a range of the other qualifications that we're fortunate enough to have in the New Zealand qualification system, running right up to the diploma and specialist investigations. Not as many numbers at those levels, but that's because the assessment is generally done through peer assessment, which is challenging because people are doing this alongside their daytime job. I guess the other thing that I've benefited from this project has been the commitment from the sector. I think Wendy alluded to that, talking about volunteers. I mean, I actually jokingly say that there's a groove in the footpath between the skills office in Featherston Street in Wellington and MB at Stout Street, because I went down to so many meetings between all of the different working groups that were set up to establish G-Reg and the qualifications in the early years. So, you know, I was literally blown away by the numbers of people who were prepared to give up their time, provide their expertise, and also provide resources. And I think one of the other amazing things is that any new organisation that approaches us about wanting to get involved with G-Reg, it's so easy for me to be able to just redirect them to one of the different agencies that's already implemented the qualifications, and the willingness of those agencies to share their experiences, their resources, has been a fantastic part of this whole network, if you like, which is what G-Reg has been about. So if I could just have the next slide for a moment, and we'll come back to the street scene in a second. Basically, every month or so, I report to G-Reg on the numbers, and I thought you might be interested to just see that we've had some pretty substantial numbers through the G-Reg qualifications. Over 8,700 people have enrolled in the last 5 years. And the most telling figure is down in the bottom right-hand corner, which is that we've had more than nearly 8,600 of them. So less than 100, or roughly around 100, who haven't yet completed, and they're probably in the process of doing so this year anyway. So that's a phenomenal rate. That's right up there. I don't know that there are many organisations or many qualifications that have had that kind of success. in part because of the online model, but also because, again, I believe that the sector have embraced these qualifications, have embraced the content of the qualifications, and you know, have proven and shown their people that they are of value to them in some shape or form. So going back to the street scene, when I try to explain to people what it is I do in the sense of working with G-Reg, I struggle sometimes, and so I quite often refer back to this cartoon, because what I try to do is say that, you know, regulation is something that most people, if you said to them, what is a regulator, they wouldn't be able to answer that question. If you show them something like the street scene and say, well, you know, what are some of the rules that keep us safe in New Zealand, and what are some of the rules you see in this picture, that means it becomes a much more apparent. So, you know, as simple as things like dog control laws, which councils enforce with the picture of the dog in the picture. Things such as the warrant of fitness for a car, the street light system, the buildings that you see in the distance. So there's way more forms of regulation in that street scene than you might imagine. So I know we were originally going to try and do a poll on this, but essentially I've used this cartoon across a number of different types of groups to ask if they could identify, and I had one particular individual who reckoned he could find more than 60 instances of regulation in that single picture. So I'm not going to suggest that that's what you came up with, but if you came up with more than 30, you're probably quite an experienced regulator and know what you are looking at here. But it's incredible. I also put this cartoon in front of a group of Vietnamese regulators who were visiting New Zealand a few years ago, and I asked them the same question, and most of them came up with less than 10. And they were saying to me, oh, you've got a lot of regulation in New Zealand. And I did suggest that perhaps they don't quite have enough regulation in Vietnam. But anyway, that's my little presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tony. That was really great, and I really like your emphasis on, you know, how to make this easy for people, so that, you know, because you don't want to catch them out like a normal kind of qualification, but you actually want to help them to learn. You're talking about the online really resonated with me, and I think because that's what ANZOG has had to do as a teaching organisation over the last 2 years, is to pivot to online, and actually it's fascinating how well it works. It's just different. It's not any better or worse, but it's just different, and different people have different styles of learning. So it was excellent, and I didn't even attempt to see how many I could see in that picture, but I'm probably with the Vietnamese on that one, I think. So let's move on. So our last speaker is Lorraine, who's going to give us an overview of the Australian Foundations of Regulatory Practice and see how that's stacking up. But please keep your questions coming, because I've got a pile of them so far that we'll put to the panel after Lorraine's spoken. So over to you, Lorraine.
Thank you. I'd first of all like to thank my New Zealand colleagues for making themselves available today. It's very generous of you, given the time of year it is. I've personally really enjoyed hearing everything you've had to say about your experiences of the G-Reg programme. This webinar is incredibly timely for us over here in NRCoP land and ANZOG, as we look to roll out our programme of professional development training for regulators. So I'm going to give a brief overview on the Foundations of Regulatory Practice programme that we are currently developing. I will urge you to log on to the ANZOG website, go to the regulators section, the NRCoP section, and there is a drop-down tab there on this project where you can find lots of information. So this will just be a little overview snippet of where we're at and a couple of bits and bobs on the timeline. So essentially, this programme does take quite a bit from the New Zealand experience, but it does differ as well. So our programme aims to provide professional development training for regulators, regardless of discipline or jurisdiction. It provides a common foundation of current modern regulatory practice, and it seeks to increase professionalism and capacity of regulators across Australia. So, as we've heard today already, there is a need to address this issue about regulators having and speaking with a common language. And we also have a need to recognise that our regulators are mobile and professional workers. So thinking about, so when I think about the audience for any of the stuff that the NRCoP does, so who is the audience for the NRCoP and for this programme, I like to think of opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of our regulators. And the example I give is those people who regulate mine safety and those who regulate early childhood education. So you could probably not think of two very different regulators there. So we've got mine safety regulators and early childhood education regulators. So everything we do needs to speak to those groups. So in terms of this programme, we need to have a programme of regulatory professional development that will speak to regulators across the spectrum. So what applies to groups of different types of regulators? So we did a survey not long after I arrived at ANZOG and the NRCoP about maybe 14 months ago, and we asked our members, what kind of previous training have you had? What would you need in terms of professional development training for your current position or any future positions? And what might that look like? And so topics and mode of delivery. What we found was that there was an overwhelming need for this broad transferable regulatory training. So rather than workplace specific or regulatory domain training, which is quite narrow in approach. So we have conceptualized this as horizontal, so quite wide training, which, and again, thinking about our two groups of regulators, one with mine safety regulation and the other with early childhood regulation. So quite broad training here. And we've also asked them for suggestions for topics. We also did an environmental scan that looked at the professional development options that were currently available. And there was an awful lot going on in the space. So what we did find out that there's a lot of organisations and a lot of regulators that get people in to do some training, and we're not quite sure what that training looks like. And you know, this is an opportunity here for us to work together, and this idea of this common language. And then there's also a need. So the environmental scan revealed there's also a need for the professional development programme to be implemented skillfully. And by that I mean that it needs to be bedded down in a way that ensures it is successful. So how do we encourage and persuade regulatory officers that this training is for them? So the clear evidence that I've got from conversations from colleagues in New Zealand is that it needs to be led from the top. So senior executives need to do the training. Allowing time for staff to do the training sends a really strong signal that this is important work. And we heard from Rebecca how she had her boss come by and said, yep, I've got my qualification. That's a really clear signal. I'm putting the time in, so therefore my staff should do it too. The other message here is this is not a set and forget. So we need to plan activities and events around the training. I have heard from other New Zealand colleagues that they ran like a mini conference or a day long or half a day event around the training. And it's got to be suitable for all learners and regulatory officers. So we need to get the balance right here between not having something which is super easy or a tick and flick course, yet also ensuring that our regulators come away with new skills and knowledge and making sure that it's achievable. So ensuring that we have support there for those learners who need it. And we've heard from Tony and also Rebecca about having support there where people can step in when someone has failed a module or an assessment or so on. And following on from Rebecca's disclosure, I too will disclose that I did the level 3 G-Reg and I did not sail straight through it. I too failed one of mine. Now Rebecca failed something on level 4, I failed something on level 3. Rebecca's in the fortunate position of receiving certificates for her completion. Iris did not receive a certificate for mine, and that, yes, Tony, I am still harping on about that. We also need to make sure that we are not doing the training in isolation. So within the online platform, our learners and our students and our regulators are feeling supported online. So this idea of the community, and this is what our NRCoP is about. We are a community of regulators. So we are not doing our training online as an individual without the community presence. So we have in progress 6 modules, so similar to the New Zealand approach. I will quickly run down what they are. So we have a very introductory Regulation 101 module. We then have a module which looks at the authorising regulatory tasks and function. We then have a module which looks at understanding and achieving compliance. Another one on regulatory tasks and functions, looking at monitoring. The 5th module is looking at effective regulatory communication, and the last module is looking at knowing your legal environment and maintaining ethical standards. So we've got a good grouping there of 6 modules, which I think will provide a very good broad based skills. So again, I will urge you to go to the ANZOG website and get some more information. We have a call out to our members and to the wider community to look for case studies that we can use within the programme. So what do you and your team do really well? Have you tackled a regulatory problem in a unique or interesting way? What can others learn from you? Remembering the 2 examples I've given about those who regulate mine safety and those who regulate early childhood education. We need to be able to step back from these individual case studies and think, what are the wider lessons that are applicable to all regulators when we're looking at our case studies? We're also looking for our NRCoP members to nominate to join into working groups for one of the 6 modules, thinking about where you can add value. These working groups will commence in mid-January, and we will be working through content and the case studies for each of the 6 modules. So can you add value to the regulatory comms module? We'd love to hear from you. Do you have something to say on ethical standards and the legal environment? Get in touch. What about the compliance module? So where can you contribute and add the most value? And finally, onto our timelines. In terms of the 6 modules, we would be looking at piloting modules 1 and 2 in April and May, modules 3 and 4 in June and July, and then modules 5 and 6 in August and September. So all things going well, we will be taking our enrolments from June through to November. So modules 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 from June through to November. So the one main difference I would say between the New Zealand course that you've heard about today and the Australian course is that we will not be doing official qualifications at the end of it. We will have a common recognised course which will be recognised amongst our community and the wider regulatory community within Australia, but we are not going down the path of a national recognised qualification. That's a much larger piece of work and not something that we feel that the community is looking for at this stage. So I'll hand it back to Sally. I'm more than happy to take questions and urge you to look on the ANZOG and the NRCoP website for some more information. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lorraine. And I thought it was interesting you talking about early childhood and going down the mines, and both of those seem quite dangerous to me, actually. And I really like this whole idea, and we've used it in the policy space as well. Like, you know, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. There's so much good stuff around the world. How can we, in policy, we used to call it steal with pride, and I stole that from the UK head of the policy profession. But it's really important to think what we can take from others. So we've got lots of questions coming in. So thank you very much to all of our presenters for those great presentations. So now it's time for the audience and their questions. So I'm going to start with, some of them are quite easy ones. So One that lots of people want is to have a high-res copy of the glossary of common terms and want to know where they can find Ian's videos. So that's an easy one for somebody just to put in the chat now. A question for you maybe, Tony, about learning styles and the 4 models of learning. Someone said, those four types of learning to suit different styles. What was the most popular?
I think that was, Sally, that was probably more for Rebecca, because she was talking about with her when they were surveying the MB learners. But essentially it follows across the entire range of people that are across organisations. There are people who just want the modules and just want to get on and do them, and they will work quite comfortably by themselves and power through them fairly quickly. And then there are others who want quite a lot of support and want to actually have some face-to-face interaction. I think I'll let Rebecca answer further, but one thing we stressed right from the beginning, I think Wendy highlighted it and so has Rebecca, that organisations do have to take some responsibility for their learners, whoever they are, whether they support them by just letting them have free rein or whether they support them by running internal workshops. And what Lorraine talked about with the Australian model, and what we definitely learned with, is you also have to paint the picture for learners of why this is relevant to them and their organisation. So why am I learning about Inland Revenue's regulatory model? I work at MB. Well, there is an answer to that, and that's quite an important one to have that conversation with learners. So I'll pass that on to Rebecca to say more.
And while you're at it, Rebecca, there's another question that's about, how important are these qualifications? How important do people see these qualifications to their career progression? Because I know we've seen surveys broadly across the public service workforce and saying more that on the job learning is arguably more important than a formal qualification. So how important is that formal qualification to them?
Sure. So I'll take the first question first, I guess, which was about the 4 different approaches. On the one hand, a hard one to answer because it does depend on the particular learner's needs, as Tony has said. I guess I could say, if you go by the numbers, self-study is the most popular because that would be the way most people have completed the qualification. But that said, I really recall one of our general managers talking about her staff and saying, look, we've got to recognise that some of my people haven't actually completed, high school qualifications. So coming and doing a level 3 is actually quite significant, and that's where we need to provide the support. So that's where those other models come into play. So whether it's the small facilitated group or the boot camps, that's where they can really play a good role. And the semester approach for our contact centre staff, that's vital because they couldn't do it otherwise unless they did it in their lunch breaks. And I mean, frankly, they deserve a break. So I'll come back to the fact that I think it's learner needs that are required to be the driver for whichever options you put in place. In terms of the value of the qualification, I mean, I totally hold with the model of, I think we sort of use 70-20-10 here, 10 being your sort of formal qualification, 70% on the job. Got no idea what the 20 stands for actually. Anyhow, probably should look that up. But I think that the qualification is a way to demonstrate the 70. So it's a way of capturing what you've actually learnt on the job. And I guess anecdotally, I've noticed people putting the qualifications on their CVs, and I do pick that up when I'm looking at CVs because I am looking for people with regulatory experience, and that's one way to demonstrate it. And again, I notice it come through on LinkedIn as well. So I just think it's a good demonstration. So I might ask for things in my job descriptions around sort of, I don't know, affinity with regulatory stewardship and experience in a regulatory system. And this is a good way to demonstrate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Lorraine, there are a whole lot for you, but and some of them I think you probably answered anyway. So one is what sort of supports will be available locally to people, and I guess that's people who want something more face-to-face than online. Someone asked how to register, so I think you've already answered that one as well. And someone asked, will you have to do them all? Like, I guess, is it sequential, or can you kind of take a pick and mix approach to the program?
Okay, so in terms of will you have to do them all, the simple answer is yes. It's a group of 6. So in terms of the consultation that we've done quite a lot of consultation with our members on this, and we only had a very small amount of people who said, you know, I only want to do module 2 and 6. And overwhelmingly, the people who said I only want to do module 2 and 6 already knew quite a bit about 2 and 6. And the intention here is to get regulators speaking with other regulators using the common language. So if we have people who already know how to speak about modules 2 and 6, we actually need them to be able to speak about the other modules. So this is a group of 6 modules, and it in terms of registering, send us an email. We are more than keen to hear from people and to get expressions of interest for this course. The other question you had for me, Sally, was
what sort of local support?
Oh, the local support. Yes, that's actually a really good question, and that's something which has come through really strong in terms of the consultations that we've had with the NRCoP community. So we it's really important that the organisation beds down this course. So it's got to be signalled really, really strong from the top. This is important. This is important for our staff, and it will be led from the top down in terms of all the signals, which are this is important, and your time to do this course is important. But going from the information we've got from our New Zealand colleagues, there must be some on-the-ground activities that will need to occur within the workplace as well. We are also investigating and looking at some form of learning communities or online learning circles, which will run alongside the program, almost like a support, an online supportive community. So we're not 100% sure what it will look like yet, and that will have to be piloted, but it could look like if you have, so the need for that community may not exist in a large regulatory organisation who is more than happy to take the reins on this and go, we are happy with this. We have got all the resources in-house to manage this ourselves. We have all the capacity, but then we also have really small regulators, and we have regulators who are in the regions who go, no, we actually need support for our staff here, and we're going to feel quite isolated doing this. So we need this community of support, and for those regulators and for those communities, we will be putting in supports. We are working with Skills New Zealand, and we're also looking at other options here of what this supportive community might look like. That is something that will be there as a support for the learners.
Thanks, Lorraine. And I promise this isn't a Patsy question, as we call them in New Zealand, or a Dorothy Dix, as you call them in Australia, but could presenters please share reflections on the overlap and differences between regulation and policy practice? And somebody else, that was 7 thumbs up, and somebody else said, is this a stupid question? Are we including people who design regulations as regulators? And this is a really, really interesting question, and one that I've had lots of debates around, it trying to develop a program to improve the quality of policy advice. If we think of regulation as a policy tool, and the front end of good regulation is good policy. So I'm not sure who to direct that one at, but I'm sure you've all got a view on it. So if you want to raise your hand, we can see. Oh, Ian, he jumped in first, and then Keith.
Well, I guess I'd just channel the fact that the first of the 5 films, again, which you and I appeared in, Sally, positioning this on the basis that both types of practitioner are part of one ecosystem. So I think limiting G-Reg to frontline performers only is missing out a vital audience. And there's perhaps, if it's not a surprise, it's maybe a surprising byproduct, or it may be just an evolving nature of the piece, that this is a broader church of which we're all a part. And it may well be that looking at how we describe those demarcations that have arisen over time is not quite the right way to do it, or at least not quite the right way to address the difference, where you've got a film that basically says better chatting together early to avoid mistakes later.
Well, I remember at the beginning, the two governance groups, one was supporting regulation and one was on policy, and pretty much the deputy secretaries were exactly the same group of people. So over to you, Keith. I know you want to say something.
Yeah, thanks, Sally. I think if the question is reflections on the overlap and differences, I mean, we've probably touched on it, but policy is really just the design, and practice is the implementation. So they are or should be joined at the hip, and we're all familiar with information flows. The practice should inform the design should be informed by practice and work for practice. So yeah, the conversations are really important, and they need to be more than conversations. We need to build systems that support the flow of information. So, you know, if you take a regulatory stewardship approach, so that we've got hard information about how things are working and we can constantly improve it. So if the question is, are the qualifications within G-Reg or within a sort of a practitioner environment appropriate for policy people, the answer is a huge yes. In our organisation, and the organisations I've been in over the last few years, everybody has done the qualification. Policy people, the practice people, and the boards, and also everybody in the administration areas, finance, reception, because they're part of a regulatory organisation and they should understand the core purpose of the organisation as a whole.
Just to add to this, the one thing that has really astonished me, and I'm in awe of every time I ask somebody who has done the very beginning qualification, the level 3 qualification, you know, what they've got out of it. It's always far more profound than I would have expected. So I think that's the other thing that we can trust, that regular practitioners, whether they're policy practitioners or people who do the implementation on the ground, they are drawing a great deal from this and from the opportunity to talk to each other as well. And I think that's what really speaks to me.
And I think this is why we call it an ecosystem. And, you know, in New Zealand, we have the Treasury with their work on regulatory quality and regulatory impact statements as well. You know, it's all part of the same thing to ensure that we have really good decision making that can be implemented and makes a difference. So, yeah, I think that whole ecosystem or infrastructure approach is really important. Another question was related to and maybe this again is for you, Rebecca, as how much you had to adapt something. So we talked about that, Keith talked about the 80-20 split, that 80% is pretty similar, and then there might be 20 around a different organisational contexts. So how did you deal with that in MB with the organisational context? Did you adapt things or just add stuff on?
And so in one respect, it was quite easy. It was actually just a matter of adding on and just as I say, bringing in our own examples. So I think from memory, there's, you know, a module that talks about information sharing and, you know, your legal kind of framework. So we were just able to bring in our legal people to talk to the cohorts and to direct them to where on our intranet site, for instance, they can ask for legal support. So, you know, and that's not something you'd expect to be in a qualification that could be for anybody. So it was just a matter of a bit of tailoring with the additional material that we produced. So we didn't find anything in the qualification that we couldn't bring into an MB context, actually, because it is quite broad, and it was just a matter of finding those additional examples to really bring it to life in here.
I would add also that there's a sort of a champions network around the G-Reg community that's really specifically tasked with working on the local conditions of the agency, because as I mentioned at the beginning, every agency is different institution, every person within it's at a different place in terms of their perceptions of their sector role, and so that can mutate quite easily and ease the kind of introduction of the qualifications and other G-Reg products into the local conditions.
So we talked. You've talked a little bit about. You know, this is a change program. It's a long-term thing. It's a system-wide thing. We talked about. People have mentioned champions, leadership, governance, and there were a few examples. For example, a deputy coming around and sort of, you know, making sure that everyone was on the right track. But are there any other examples there? Because I know, for example, in the policy space, having the Prime Minister launch our frameworks was an enormous boost to the work. But is there any what other sorts of champions or sponsors or leadership would you advise the Australians to think about that cultivating up front? I'm not sure who that's for. Maybe you, Keith and Wendy again at the start, and then back to Ian.
Yeah, Sally, I think having senior leaders, so chief executive, second tier, and in the Crown agency sense, board members, chairs, doing it is, demonstrates the sort of importance of it, and that's the sort of leadership I think that is required.
I think from an operational level, as I said, it's about showing people what's possible and actually getting some runs on the board, starting with whatever you've got, getting some success, making sure it's successful, and then showing others, hey, look, it's not that hard. So yeah, anybody can do this.
The key also is having a navigable model so that there's something in it for everybody. It's not just about A, the qualifications, B, what G-Reg has as level 3, but there are other credentialised and non-credentialised things from a chief executive to the front line in terms of a top-down structure that everybody can get something out of for themselves, as well as to be seen to be dealing because it's a good thing.
I was just going to give the MB example. Internally, we have a sort of SLT or tier 2 level governance body. So we were able to use them to sort of signal to the rest of the agency about the importance of this by providing them with reporting, and also know that at the group level, which is tier 2, tier 3, they also request reporting to help provide that visibility. So it's just another little lever for visibility and change. Sorry, Keith, over to you.
Thanks. I think there's an important conversation in some agencies, particularly that are full of highly qualified people. Perhaps they are PhDs or master's level. That, why would I do a level 3 qualification? Well, the answer to that question that we've found useful is that we want you to apply your extreme knowledge and experience in a regulatory context. So, the way you can do that is understand the common principles and concepts and approaches to regulation so that you can use your expertise in the most helpful way for our organisation. And, why would I take part in this? Why would I be part of a cohort with people that have never done any academic work or never got any qualification? Well, maybe you won't learn anything, but you can share your knowledge. So I think everybody can see a way of contributing and learning.
That's a really excellent point. It's not just about taking, it's what can you give as well. And I think sometimes the more we have to explain something ourselves that's become second nature to us, the more we understand it, and to have to articulate that is really important. What about the other thing? Have we got any more questions? One of the issues that I think is interesting is what sort of support you need for the whole program. And you, I think it was Keith, talked about getting funding and having a secretariat now supporting the whole program, and how you managed to get the buy-in for that, because I'm sure Australia will need something as well, because I know Lorraine is working very, very hard, but she probably needs some more support. But even at a local, even a jurisdictional level in Australia, there might be some need for some secretariat support.
We've done it through our Chief Executive Oversight Group. So at the sort of the top of the G-Reg structure, if you like, there's a group of chief executives from what are regarded as the original funding agencies. So I mentioned we started in 2012 with a small pool of agencies contributing some money. They're still together, and that money has increased twice actually quite recently. We've had in mind for a couple of years a budget bid to get an appropriation to support this. Given the situation, COVID, etc., that hasn't made it through the gates so far. CE's committed to an increase in resources recently, really to strengthen the secretariat, and for the first time have a really solid secretariat with a full-time director and other resources around it. MB does a lot of in-kind support and contributes other resources as well, but then the whole sector contributes in kind in a very significant way, as we've discussed.
Yeah, I think that's for all of these whole of government things. It's how they fund it. Are they club funded so people have skin in the game and therefore really care about it, or do we get some central funding over the top? There's one question here. Will there be something around stepping into the role of the regulator, the power relationship with the regulated community, and developing a regulatory mindset? And I guess that's for people who could become beholden to the sector or the stakeholder group. Has anybody got some thoughts on that? Has that been an issue in New Zealand?
I think the topic of regulatory capture, particularly for industry regulators that bring a lot of people in from the industries that are regulated, it's a conversation that occurs. For us, it occurs as part of the cohort support. So I don't recall, and Tony may remember, whether within the 6 modules of level 3 there's anything specific about regulatory culture or being an industry person turning into a regulator, but it's certainly a topic of discussion in the cohorts that I've been involved in supporting and talking with.
Yeah. I think we're just about running out of time, are we? I'm going to ask Lorraine to nod at me if that's the case. No. I can't hear you. Maybe you speak, Lorraine?
No, I think we're okay for another 5 minutes. I might add a quick comment on that question about the regulatory mindset. Please do. In terms of the Australian course, we are covering that. So we're looking at things like creating a regulatory mindset. In our module 6, we're looking specifically at ethical standards, knowing your legal environment, but we're also within the course looking to develop a regulatory toolkit, so an interactive regulatory toolkit, which the participant can, so they'll be provided with a scenario and they can interact with the toolkit and look at the different tools which would be available in a particular situation, and have, you know, a particular case study and interact, and what would happen if I chose tool A or B or C with context around it. So this is something that I think will be, it's going to take a bit of work, and but I think it will be really good to be able to see that in, you know, I'm doing this because I feel like I can touch it, you know. I obviously am in need of a bit of a break, but I think it will be important for the learners to be able to interact with it, to see what when we talk about tools and choices and this idea of regulatory capture as well. I mean, we will be looking at what I call big C, little c capture. So these are really obvious incidences of regulatory capture, but then we've got lots of little small things which possibly, maybe, but there's a cumulative effect there, you know. And we're actually looking at doing a webinar on this very topic next year as well, so stay tuned.
Right, and I guess the underpinning thing is just a broader public sector code of conduct anyway, and to regulate behaviour. Let's see if we've got any other. Good question. Do you have an expected price for the course? And that's had a few thumbs up, so down to brass tacks now.
So we can give a guide, is what we can give. So it will be in and around this price will be for the NRCoP members. So if you have what is currently called the corporate membership, the 6 modules will be in and around the 550 mark. For those who are not currently corporate members, you should really consider taking out and joining the NRCoP, because the price will be significantly much more. The idea here is that with our community of practice, this is something which we want to price at a point that will be taken up en masse here. But the value must be for our members. So get in contact as well, please.
And I was just thinking about the previous question about capture, and I think scenarios are a great tool for making people think through their decisions. And one of reminded me of one of Ian's films, The Judge on My Shoulder. And every time I think about some decision now, I think about a miniature Ian sitting on my shoulder telling me whether I'm doing it right or not.
That is indeed a regulatory deterrent. The only other thing that I'd add,
yes,
that is terrifying. The only thing I'd actually add, Sally, also on the capture point, is the recent G-Reg films, the piece that followed the one that you appeared in, on the Port and Harbour Marine Safety Code of New Zealand is a kind of apex stakeholder-driven model that could be prone to capture, but because of its careful design, of which Keith was a part, it isn't. And episode 7 of the webinars also deals with public-private, effectively delegation of state power to a private entity as to pest control. They're worth watching because they can talk to certain models which go around the capture point, and they're online as we speak, or will be, sorry, on Friday.
Well, I think we might end there with Ian's advertisement, and everybody can go and have a look at those films now. So nobody's going to be watching Love Actually this Christmas, I don't think. So I think that's all we have time for today. I'm at time now on my clock. So thank you again to our speakers for their incredible wisdom and experience.